Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being part of this webinar series. My name is Michelle. I'm one of the tutors at the CDCL. And before we begin, I want to present how you can access all of our resources by visiting our website. So let me know if you can see the tab.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so if you go to Google and you search UPRRP Competencias Lingüísticas, you will get our official webpage, which is part of La Facultad de Estudios Generales. And if you press on that first link, you can find our Spanish and English resources. Both of them have links to our online revisions, which is personalized tutoring with one of the tutors. And you can get also modules and infographics. So both of them are in Spanish and English. You can get modules, or if you're more of a visual person, you can get infographics. So the one that we are going to be using today, you can find if you visit our English modules. They are categorized, so you can find spelling and grammar, reading strategies, writing strategies, and digital literacy. So the one that we are going to be using today is academic writing. You click on it, this is what you can expect to see. The one that we are going to be using for this webinar is a little bit different, but it's essentially the same information. So if you can go to our website, you can find a very similar version and you can follow this one or refer to it for back to it at any point in time. These resources are available 24/7. Okay, so I'm going to go back so I can show my... No pueden ver la presentación ahora, ¿verdad?
No.
Vamos a volver. Okay, there we go.
Ahora sí, Michelle. Sí.
Thank you. Okay, so like I said before, we are going to be discussing academic writing. And before we begin, I want to let you know the objectives of this webinar. So after this webinar, you will be able to differentiate between the active and passive voice, recognize the elements of formal register, know which characteristics of informal register to avoid, and identify different points of view in writing. Now, the first thing we have to discuss is what is academic writing? Well, academic writing refers to non-fiction texts produced in the context of academic works. So in other words, it's the type of writing that is expected from scholars or students in an academic setting like a university. Now, academic writing is different from other types of writing because of its style. And this is precisely what we're going to be talking about today. So the content is not necessarily going to be different than other types of writing, but the style is. So we're going to be talking about three specific categories, and the first is register. So academic writing is characterized by being formal. And formal is directly related to register, and register refers to the style of language that we use in a particular communicative situation, and it will vary depending on the audience and purpose. So these two things are very important, the audience and the purpose. Before we start to write, we have to ask ourselves, who is our audience? And in an academic setting, our audience is probably our professor or our instructor and their classmates. Now, if we combine these two elements, our professor and our classmates, we have to acknowledge that these people are in an academic setting, so they will expect something that is formal, something that is well written, so that follows grammatical structure, punctuation rules, all of those things. So let's first differentiate what formal means in comparison with informal. So I have these two very short paragraphs. One of them is informal and the other one is formal. So first I'm going to read the one on the left, which is in the color purple, and it says, I saw the dude was walking down the street and you could tell he was like totally wasted. He literally started smashing car windows and was yelling cuss words at the people there. It was really something. Now, This is something that we could probably say to a friend, to someone who we are very familiar with, if we were telling them something that we saw. Now, how can we say this exact same information if we were writing it academically? It would sound something like this. A visibly intoxicated man was seen walking down 44th Street. He destroyed car windows and screamed profanities at bystanders. The event was quite remarkable. So if you look at what they say exactly the same thing. They say that a man that was drunk was walking down the street. He destroyed cars and yelled cuss words. They say the exact same thing, but one of them is very informal and one of them is very formal. So this is what we mean by academic writing. It means saying something that we can probably say to a friend, but saying it in a specific way, in a formal way, that will sound more eloquent, that will sound probably more informed, but sound, well, formal. So let's now differentiate informal and formal. So informal is characterized by being casual and conversational. So it's the kind of language that we use if we're talking to a friend, to a family member, to someone who we really know, who we are comfortable with. And it is very spontaneous, which means that it does not necessarily follow conventional rules or structures. When we are talking, we are not necessarily thinking, oh, I have to follow this particular order because I have to have the subject, and then I have to have the verb, and then I have to have the object. We don't think any of that. We just speak, we think something, and we say it. Now, formal register, which is what we use in academic writing, always has to adhere to grammatical rules. So we have to keep in mind syntax, grammar in general, punctuation rules, the language that we use. Always keep in mind these aspects. And also, precise and concise language. We will define what precise and concise means, but in general, academic writing always prefers formal register. So, now we are going to talk about two aspects of informal register that we should always avoid in academic writing. The first one is colloquialisms. You might have not heard this word, but colloquialisms are words or phrases used in familiar conversations, and they can include idioms or slang. So they're just expressions that we usually use when we are speaking informally. So for example, we can say they trashed it, meaning they destroyed it. So trash is a verb. You can find it in the dictionary. However, it is very informal. Sounds like something you would say to a friend. So when writing academically, we don't want to sound like we are talking to a friend. So we would find a word that's more formal, more academic, in this case, destroyed. The second example, it's raining cats and dogs. So that's an idiom, que sería un refrán en español. En español, este sería como se está cayendo el cielo. So instead of saying the idiom, we would say what it means. So in English, it's raining cats and dogs would mean it is pouring or it is raining heavily. So idioms are very, very casual. They are very informal. So in academic writing, if you can avoid them, do it. And then lastly, we have this example. That is literally what she said. So literally is a very common word nowadays, but literally doesn't necessarily add any meaning to what we're saying. Literally just means that it actually happened. So unless you are making a distinction of what is figurative and what is literal, it is best to avoid saying the word literally. So for example, instead of saying that is literally what she said, you can just say that is what she said, because the sentence in itself is already saying it or stating it as a fact. You don't have to add the word literally. Okay, so the second aspect of informal register that we should avoid is contractions. And contractions are the shortened version of two combined words, and they are very common. We use them in regular talk every day, but they are considered informal. So in academic writing, it's always important to use the full form. For example, instead of writing it's, we would write it is. Instead of writing can't, we would write cannot. Instead of writing there, we would write they are. So always use the full form. And always means consistently. So if you start writing in full form, don't change back to contractions and then back to full form. Always use full form. Now, let's talk about formal register. Formal register is characterized by concise and precise language. So when we are writing, we should be concise and precise. So let's first explain what conciseness means. So conciseness means to communicate a message with few words. So when writing academically, always think less is more. We sometimes think that if we write a lot or if our sentences are very long, that we will sound more eloquent or that we will sound more informed, and that is not necessarily the case. Sometimes we end up writing really, really long sentences that sound very wordy and say nothing at all. So, for example, if we have the phrase due to the fact that is 5 words, and it means the exact same thing as because. So if we can use a shorter version of the phrase or even a single word that means the exact same thing, it is probably best to stick with the shorter version, the more concise version. The second example says, I screamed loudly. Now, you would make this more concise by saying just I screamed, because by definition, a scream is already loud. So when we are writing academically, always make sure that you check the definitions of the words. Because if the definition already implies something, then writing it out would be redundant. And then lastly, we gave a presentation. And giving a presentation is an expression that we say a lot. However, we can make this shorter, more concise, by just saying we presented. Instead of the expression gave a presentation, there is a single verb that means the exact same thing, which is presented. So usually we write really long phrases that can sometimes be summarized with just one verb. So always make sure that you are finding the best verb or the best word for this context. And that leads us to precision. And precision in writing is the quality of being exact, meaning finding the best word or phrase for each context. So for example, you can say, I bought something. Well, what is that something? Well, you always want to make sure the reader knows exactly what you are talking about. So if you know what that something is, let's say you were writing about apparel and it means new shoes, then it will be better to say, I bought new shoes. Say exactly what you mean. Then we have the example, he said a lot of things. And this is also very common when we are writing analytic essays, for example. We are talking about a character who said a lot of things. Well, what were those lots of things? We want to make sure that the reader knows what we are talking about. So we would write, he said it was justified and necessary, for example. We would write exactly, precisely what they said. Likewise, the last example, this quote is very interesting. Now, we use this expression a lot, and interesting is a valid adjective. However, it could sometimes be very vague. So what does interesting mean? Well, maybe in that quote, it means that it showcases particular themes. So it would be probably best if we say specifically what it means and not just say it's very interesting, because like I said, that is very vague. Okay, so questions up till now?
No veo preguntas en el chat. Si alguno de los compañeros quisieran participar con el micrófono. Okay, pues yo creo que podemos seguir, Michelle.
Now we're going to go into a practice. So I want you to practice modulating these two types of register. So if you were giving this question or this prompt, what is love? And you have to explain what is love to a 5-year-old child and to a chemistry professor. So let's first say or explain how we can describe a 5-year-old child and how can we describe a chemistry professor. So what are some characteristics of a 5-year-old child? I can't see the chat, so if somebody pueden hacer la mano o pueden escribir en el chat y María entonces lo lee.
Por ahora nadie me ha comentado nada, Michelle.
Okay, so let's say that we are talking to a niece and she is 5 years old and you would have to tell her what is love. What kinds of words or what kind of description could you say? Let's say the 5-year-old child probably doesn't know a lot of words and they're probably very hyperactive, so they probably don't have a lot of time to listen to you. So whereas the chemistry professor, who is someone who is well-informed, who has studied a lot, who is a specialist in their field, how can we describe what is love? So just one sentence, how can you tell them what is love?
Well, we would have to keep it short and simple. For example, Alondra Alvarez comentó, love makes you happy and feels good.
Perfect. So that one has two characteristics. It gives you the emotion, so it makes you happy, and it feels good. So it gives you like an imagery, something that they can relate to if they are 5. So they probably won't understand a definition of love, but if you tell them how they would feel, they could probably relate to it. Now, what would you say if you had to tell your chemistry professor what is love? What would you tell your chemistry professor?
That one is a little difficult. For example, Paola Santiago comenta, love is the force that moves the world. Paola did, and then I would guess that's what it means for the 5-year-old. And then for the professor, Paola comenta, it is a chemical reaction.
A chemical reaction, so perfect. Now we are using what we call jargon. So a chemical reaction, if you were to say that to a 5-year-old child, they would probably have no idea what you're talking about. However, a chemistry professor would know exactly what you're talking about. So jargon is something that we use in formal register because jargon is words, they are words that are specific for a field. So if you were talking about chemistry, we would talk about chemical reactions. So,
Sofía también comenta, Michelle, para el profesor de química, love is an emotion produced by the brain.
Perfect. So it's an emotion produced by the brain. So again, if we were to say this to a 5-year-old child, they would probably not understand, but to a chemistry professor, it's just the appropriate language to use. So this is how I would describe love to a 5-year-old child. Love is when you really care about someone or something. It's a feeling that can be shown with a hug or a kiss, for example. So if we were talking very informally, we would use examples, we could use imagery, we could use comparisons, so metaphors or similes. Now, if we were writing more formally, let's say for a chemistry professor, we can say romantic love can be broken down into 3 categories: lust, attraction, and attachment. High levels of dopamine and a related hormone, norepinephrine, are released during attraction. These chemicals make us giddy, energetic, and euphoric, even leading to decreased appetite and insomnia. So if we compare these 2 descriptions, we can see that the more formal version, the one for the chemistry professor, has longer sentences, so more complex sentences, whereas the first one has simple sentences. Also, we can notice jargon. So like I said, dopamine, hormones, norepinephrine, these are specific words for the field of chemistry. Something that if we were writing formally or we were talking, we would probably not say. Okay, questions or comments up till now?
Por ahora no me aparece nada en el chat, Michelle.
Okay, thank you. So now we are going to go into the second category of formal writing or academic writing. And that is active and passive voice. So some of you might have had professors or instructors tell you, don't write in passive voice. Well, why is that? And it doesn't mean that passive voice is wrong. On the contrary, passive voice is a correct way of writing or speaking, but it has to be done properly. And because it's usually not done properly, it can sometimes be confusing. And that's why some professors or instructors tell you don't write in passive voice. So let's first define what active and passive voice mean. So in the active voice, the subject performs the action of the verb. So we have a subject, and that person or that thing is doing what the action of the verb. So for example, students handed in the project before the due date. So students is the subject, and they are the ones handing in the project. So the subject performs the action. Then we have, I gave him a big hug. I am the subject, and I gave him. So I am performing the action. And then the last one, after the game, they went to eat pizza. They are the subject, and they went to eat, so they are performing the action. Now, in the passive voice, the subject receives the verb's action. So the focus is on the object instead of the agent. So for example, the projects were handed in by the students on time. Who is handing in the students? That's called the agent. And the students is now not the focal point. It's not the beginning of the sentence. It's at the end. What we are focusing on is the object, which is the projects. So the projects were handed in by the students. Then we have, the bill was signed into law this morning. So the bill is the object, and that is what's being signed. Now, we don't know what or who is signing this bill. Likewise, in the third example, I was added to the dean's list. I am the object because I am being added. But again, we don't know who is adding me to the list. Now, these two are very specific or very different from the first one because we don't know who the agent is. And that is something we can do with passive voice. In the passive voice, you can choose not to show the agent, either because you don't know it or because you want to focus on the object instead of the agent. So it doesn't necessarily mean, or this doesn't mean that there is no agent. There is. It's just hidden or invisible. So a way that we can construct the passive voice, there are many ways, but a very common structure is starting with the object, then having the to be verb and the past participle verb, and then by and the agent. And like I said, the by and agent can be hidden, so you can choose not to include this. So to explain sort of a little bit the to be verb and the past participle verb, if you were to have a simple past verb, you can say I approved. Now, if we were to use the to be verb and the past participle verb, you would have to write it was approved. So it has was, which is the auxiliary, the to be verb, and then the past participle verb. And it is the exact same in Spanish. So in Spanish, you would have lo aprobé, just one word. And in the past participle, en español, sería fue aprobado. So the first one is just one, and the second one is two. So in the passive voice, we will always have two, the auxiliary and the main verb. So let's see some examples of what passive voice looks like. So the first one, the class is taught by Anne. So the class is the object, and that is what is being taught. And then by Anne is the agent. Dave was expelled by the committee. So Dave is the object, was expelled. So that is the action being performed on David or Dave. And then by the committee, who is doing the action. And it will be released by them on Friday. It is the object. Will be released is the verb. By them, the agent. And then on Friday, it's just additional information, in this case, relating time. Now, in formal or in academic writing, active voice is generally preferred. So sentences in passive voice tend to be wordy, less direct, and can even be confusing, especially when they are overused. Because of the grammatical structure that emphasizes the object instead of the agent. So like we saw in the example that was in Spanish, the active voice uses only one verb, whereas passive uses two. So most always, passive voice tends to be longer. That's why academic writing prefers you to use active, because it's shorter, it's clearer, it's more concise. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you can never use the passive voice. You can use the passive voice, but try to only use it if you do not know the agent. In that case, you would have to use the passive, or if you absolutely have to emphasize the object. So, questions up till now?
No veo preguntas, un poquito de tiempo a ver si alguien quiere anotar algo o participar por medio del micrófono. Bueno, Michelle, no veo manitas levantadas ni comentarios, así que yo creo que podemos seguir.
Okay, so now we are going to go into a practice. So I want you to change this sentence from the passive voice to the active voice. So, like I said, we would use the order that I gave previously. So object, verb, and then agent. So if we have the sentence, the bill was passed by legislators, how can we change the order to make it into active voice?
Marina Reyes Huertas comenta, the legislators passed the bill.
Excellent. So we would change the order and we would put the agent, which is the legislators, first. So the legislators passed the bill. That's exactly how you would change it. Okay, now let's change this one too. We have online classes were confirmed by the administration. So how will we change this into active voice?
Michelle Juan Avilés nos comenta, the administration confirmed online classes.
Perfect. So again, the agent will be moved to the beginning of the sentence, and that will be the administration. So the administration confirmed online classes. Okay, so lastly, we have this sentence. Commercial buildings and residences were vandalized as a result of the protest. How can we change this passive sentence into active?
Esta es un poquito diferente a las estructuras que vimos anteriormente, ¿verdad, Michelle?
Exactly. So here, do we know the agent? Do we know who is vandalizing?
Marina comenta que no sabemos.
Exactly. So we do not have the exact information there, but we can infer. So when we are in a protest, if we are in a protest, what are we called?
Michelle Paola Santiago nos escribió una respuesta, no a la pregunta que acabas de hacer, pero su atenta al ejercicio. As a result of the protest, the commercial buildings and residences were vandalized.
Okay, so here we have a verb. Let me see if I can open the chat. Okay, were vandalized. So here you're using the exact verb that's in the passive sentence. So it is still in passive voice. We would have to change the verb to just one verb.
Okay. Alondra Álvarez nos comenta también, protesters vandalized commercial buildings and residences.
Okay, very good. So here we would have to include the agent because in the original we didn't have it. So we can infer that if we are in a protest, we are called protesters. So we can use protesters as the subject. So like Alondra said, we can say protesters vandalized commercial buildings and residences. We could also say they vandalized commercial buildings and residences if we wanted to use a pronoun. Let's see if I can. There we go. So protesters vandalized commercial buildings and residences. So sometimes, like I said, we can choose not to show the agent. So that makes it a little bit harder to change it into active voice. However, based on the context, we can almost always infer who is doing the action. Also, if there are more sentences, there's probably information about who did that, who acted on that sentence. So then we can use that information to change it and then use that agent as the subject. Okay, questions up till now?
No sé si alguno de los participantes quisiera hacer alguna pregunta. Si quieren participar por medio del micrófono, ahora mismo tienen la oportunidad de levantar la mano. Bueno, pues si nadie tiene preguntas y estamos todos claros con lo que nos está enseñando en la presentación, ok, Marina. Marina nos levantó la mano. Marina, cuando quieras puedes encender el micrófono para participar.
Sí, buenas tardes. Michelle, una pregunta. ¿Podría haber el caso de que no necesariamente hayan sido los protestantes quienes hayan vandalizado?
Of course. So if you had that information and you don't want to infer who did it, you can say they, and you don't have to say a specific noun. So you don't have to say protesters. You can just say they and make it ambiguous. Or if that can be a case, if you do not know who vandalized, that could be a case of using the passive voice correctly. So if you do not know who did it, for example, that's usually done like the news, for example. If the news reporter does not know who did it, they will use the passive voice because that way you can avoid saying who did it. So if you do not know, then using the passive voice would be correct. If you do know, then using the active voice is preferred. Does that answer your question?
Sí, muchas gracias.
Perfect. Okay. Any other questions?
Ok, no veo nada por ahora, pero gracias por participar, Marina.
Okay, so now let's go into the last element of academic writing that we are going to be discussing, and that is point of view. And point of view refers to the perspective from which a text is written. Now, point of view affects the tone, and the tone of the text can be defined as the attitude or style that we assume when writing. So the point of view affects how the reader interacts with and to the text. So when we are writing, we assume a perspective. There are three ways that we do this. We can choose the first person, the second person, or the third person point of view. So the first person point of view is written from the I or we perspective. So I, as an author, am including myself in whatever it is that I am writing. So it can be singular or plural. I can say, for example, I love you, or I can say we celebrated. So if I am including myself as an author, but I am just including myself, I would use the singular. If I were including other people and myself, then I would use we. Now, second person point of view is a text written directly to somebody else. So directly, speaking directly to someone. So this is what we use when we are speaking to a friend, to a family member. We talk to them as you. We say, you are very friendly, for example. Now, the third person point of view is a text about he, she, it, or they. So depending on if it's a thing or if it's a person, if it's singular or if it's plural, we would say, for example, it is not acceptable, or they were frightened, or she is the best. So here, I am not included. If I am the author, I am not included in what I am writing. I am talking about them. So in academic writing, we usually prefer to write in the third person. However, I'll make a disclaimer here, always consult your professor's instructions for each writing assignment. So each professor has their own preferences. So he or she might want you to write in first person if it's an argumentative essay, for example, or they are particularly looking to see how you would write in second person, so they will probably tell you write in second person. However, if they do not tell you, or if they say, oh, it's up to you, then third person point of view is generally preferred. Now, the most important thing about point of view is that you should be consistent. So don't change from first person to second person to third person to first to second to third. We would always use third person consistently, or if you were writing in first person consistently. Okay, questions up to here.
Sí, Michelle, tengo una pregunta de Jennifer Ortiz. Una pregunta. If we don't know the character's gender, can we not use they, them pronouns?
Yes, you can. Well, that also depends on the style manual. If you are following a specific style manual, so for example, MLA doesn't allow you to use plural pronouns if it's singular character. However, if you are not using a specific style manual, you can change the subject to plural to avoid saying he or she. Does that answer your question?
Sí, Michelle.
Okay, perfect. So, for certain types of text, for example, argumentative essays, first person point of view is appropriate. However, we sometimes think that if our professor or instructor said you have to write a reflective essay or an argumentative essay, that we have to say I think or I believe, and that's not necessarily the case. Actually, in academic writing, it's usually best to avoid saying I, because you want to separate yourself from what you are saying, so use the third person point of view, and then provide supporting arguments. So do not solely rely on your own opinion. So for example, instead of saying, I think this is the best solution, you can say, this is the best solution. However, there is a catch here. You are stating your opinion as a fact by saying this is the best solution. So in academic writing, it is very, very important that you provide supporting arguments. So something that proves that this is the best solution. So that would include statistics, quotes, words. So maybe you can use a phrase from something that you were reading. If you were writing about an essay or a story, then you can quote direct parts of that story. Something that proves that you are right. Likewise, instead of saying, I found his story to be riveting yet brief, you can just say the exact same thing without saying I. So his story was riveting yet brief. So just because you have to write a reflective essay or an argumentative essay doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be in first person. So there's always a way to write in third person. Okay, questions up to here?
¿Alguien tiene alguna duda o pregunta que quieran compartir? ¿Algún comentario? Parece que no, Michelle.
Okay, so now we are going to practice changing a very short paragraph from first person to third person. So I'm first going to read these very short sentences. In this essay, I will define key terms about colonialist policies, and then I will provide some background information of the situation. Next, I will explain both sides of the argument regarding colonialism and explain why I support one of these positions. Lastly, I will explain why perpetuating colonialism is wrong. So, what parts part or parts of this essay makes it first person.
Marina nos comenta the pronoun I.
Perfect. So the pronoun I is the subject in every sentence. So I will define, I will provide. So how can we get rid of the I? So eliminate the first person point of view and make it into third person. How can we change, let's say, the first sentence into third person?
Si alguien quiere leer su propia versión por medio del micrófono, lo pueden hacer para que no tengan que copiarlo todo. O también podemos ir oración por oración, ¿verdad, Michelle?
Exactly. You can just probably, instead of saying the entire sentence, how can we change the subject? So instead of saying I, what can we change it for?
Alondra Álvarez y Sofía Torres nos comentan it.
Okay, so what does it refer to? We have to keep in mind, you can use it, but we have to keep in mind, what does it refer to?
Exacto, ya estaban calientes por ahí. Alondra Álvarez nos comenta the essay.
Exactly. So if we are writing an essay, instead of saying, or instead of focusing on what I think, I'm going to focus on what I am writing. So I'm writing an essay. So I can say, and this essay will define key terms about colonialist policies. And to avoid repeating it, we can say, and will provide some background of the information. So in the first sentence, we have I repeated. So we can instead say the essay in the first time, and then eliminate the second one. And we can just repeat the verb. So if we were to change, for example, this short paragraph, we can say this paper or this essay, exact same thing, will define and contextualize colonialist policies. Throughout time, governments and social groups have raised both arguments in favor and against colonialism. Lastly, this essay aims to showcase the negative effects of colonialism. Now, the second sentence is a little bit different because I didn't change it to the essay will do this. Instead, I focused on what I am talking about. So instead of focusing on the essay or what I think, I'm going to focus on the ideas. So if I am talking about an argument, I can say who is perpetuating or who is argumenting these ideas. In this case, it's governments and social groups. So I would choose to use that as the subject. So governments and social groups have raised arguments in favor and against colonialism. And then the last sentence, I repeated what you guys had suggested, which is this essay aims to showcase the negative effects of colonialism. Now, in this sentence, I changed something, and it says, in the original version, it says, explain why perpetuating colonialism is wrong. And this is something that's very common in reflective or argumentative essays. We want to say, this is right, or this is wrong. And it doesn't necessarily mean that that is an incorrect way of saying it, but it's not very formal. It's not very academic. So in academic writing, we can suggest that something is right or wrong by proving it. So for example, I would say this essay aims, so it's not necessarily telling you, oh, this is right or this is wrong. It's saying that the essay wants to show how colonialist or the negative effects of colonialist policies. So you leave it up to the reader to decide if it's right or wrong, even though you are going to direct them into a decision. So when writing academically, we don't necessarily want to tell the reader this is right or this is wrong. We want to prove it. So that's where supporting arguments or cites, all of that comes into play. Okay, so now let's wrap up all of these comments into a short list of academic writing do's and don'ts. So in academic writing, always write in the active voice whenever possible. Always write concisely, precisely, and accurately. So remember, less is more. Use full forms, so avoid contractions, always. Use formal expressions, so don't go using idioms or slang. And always consult your professor about the best point of view of each text. If the professor doesn't say, or if the professor tells you you can write in whatever point of view that you want, preferably use the third person. Now, don'ts of academic writing: don't overuse the passive voice. Only use it if it's absolutely necessary, meaning if you do not know the agent, or if you absolutely have to emphasize the object. Do not be wordy or redundant. Like I said, less is more. Don't be vague or ambiguous. So tell the reader exactly what you're talking about. Do not use contractions. Do not use colloquialisms or slang. And do not choose point of view randomly or change randomly inside your text. So always be consistent. Okay, so that is up to here. Any questions, comments, doubts?
No veo preguntas en el chat, Michelle. Si alguien quiere levantar la mano, están bienvenidos a hacerlo. Igualmente, a todas las personas que llegaron un poquito después a la actividad, quería informarles que van a ver por ahí el enlace a la evaluación del webinar. Es bien importante que la puedan llenar para que nos dejen saber, ¿verdad?, cómo fue la experiencia de aprendizaje y también para que nosotros podamos mejorar en la elaboración de los webinars. También es importante que la llenen porque por medio de la evaluación van a recibir el sello de participación que funciona como evidencia para el profesor de que efectivamente estuvieron aquí con nosotros hoy. Bueno, creo que no hay preguntas, Michelle. Igualmente, si tienen alguna pregunta y sienten que no pueden proponerla aquí, siempre nos pueden escribir al Centro de Desarrollo para las Competencias Lingüísticas y ahí estamos para servirles.
Thank you all very much for participating in this webinar series. Like Maria said, we are always available for personal revisions if you contact us directly. And if you have any questions, you can write them in the chat or you can raise your hand at any time. Thank you. Thank you for participating.
Muchas gracias a ustedes por participar y estar aquí con nosotras hoy. También pueden encontrar el módulo en la página oficial del CDCL por si quieren repasarlo. Y también tenemos un Google Form que pueden tomar, es un tipo de quiz para que puedan corroborar, ¿verdad?, las cositas que aprendieron hoy. Gracias por participar y que tengan muy buenas tardes.